Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first of two mini lectures for Module 3, where we'll be addressing different aspects of social work, values, and ethics. And again, the purpose of these mini lectures is to supplement things that we may not have as much time to cover in class, or that I think might be useful places where I'm just providing more information that you can go back and kind of review things if that would be helpful. So, as you know, this module focuses on social work values and ethics. But it does so in, we're not just talking about ethics all the time. We're talking also about this kind of big idea, which is, what's the point of ethics? Why have a code of ethics? What does all this mean? And really it goes back to the idea that one of the core aspects of social work is this notion of professional use of self in service of our core values. And so the code of ethics is kind of how we enact that. How do we not just help people, because it's nice to help people, but do so in a way that is guided by some professional standards? And how do we kind of achieve our core values in those standards? Something I want you to keep in mind throughout this module, we'll talk about this when we meet as well, is I love this quote from your Gasker text that says on page 79, mature critical thinking makes social workers wonder whether what they believe is real. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think if we're really serious about our ethical decision making, we're going to find that the more we think about things, the grayer sometimes things get. The more we can see different sides, right? The more that we can kind of understand when we have a true ethical dilemma, kind of what the different courses of action might be, and the more challenging sometimes our decision making is, because we can truly understand different perspectives, and we're really dedicated to questioning whether our initial assumptions, our initial responses, our gut responses are correct, right? And that's really, really important. I think that's really a sign of maturity in your practice. And so you'll find, I think, with ethics that often where students feel, I think that the more they practice, they might feel more certain about their ethical decision making. And I actually think that the reverse is true. We tend to move away from kind of black and white thinking and towards thinking that, again, is much more contextualized. And that doesn't mean that we're wishy-washy on ethics. So we'll kind of talk about this, but it does mean that we really start to internalize a process for decision making that teaches us to question ourselves, to question, again, our assumptions, to question the policies that we operate under, and that doing those things is really the goal, right? Being to that place where we can really ask those deep questions as we make ethical decisions is really critical. So again, don't feel like if you're finding yourself, knowing the code of ethics, knowing the standards, and yet struggling with decisions and, kind of struggling with the reality that you can see multiple sides, multiple courses of action, that's okay. That's where you should be. So I just want to put that out there. All right, we're going to talk about professional use of self in class quite a bit together. So I'm going to skip over this portion, and we're going to focus here on the code of ethics in this lecture. So I want you to understand a little bit about the history and purpose of it. I want you to understand how it's organized, what's in it. And then when we're together, we'll do a little fun activity, kind of searching through the code of ethics. But let's talk about what it is. So, we talked when last we met about that article, the 100-Year Debate, and kind of the root origins of the social work profession. So the code of ethics is established in the 60s, again, kind of another effort to professionalize our field, right, in different ways. It serves 6 purposes. These purposes are outlined in the code itself, right? But it's important to know kind of what's the point. So one, it identifies our core values, right, those things that we talked about, service, right, social justice, all of those. We'll talk more about them in a minute. So it identifies those. It summarizes some broad ethical principles that kind of reflect those values. So it lets us know kind of what does it look like, if our value is, social justice, what does that mean? Okay, what is the principle behind that? The code also helps us identify what we need to think about when ethical uncertainties or ethical dilemmas arise, or when obligations conflict. It also allows the public and our colleagues to hold us accountable to a certain standard of behavior in terms of ethics. It also helps to socialize new practitioners to the field. So that's you all, right? This is why we're engaging in these discussions now. It gives us kind of a shared language as a profession, and as new people come into the profession, they join kind of within this body of folks who adhere to these standards and these beliefs. It also articulates standards that we can use ourselves, so not just the public can hold us accountable, but we can hold one another accountable. Excuse me. And NASW actually has formal procedures for dealing with complaints for folks who are not adhering to the code of ethics. So that's important to know. So it does lots of things. Again, it's kind of this unifying document in which we all kind of agree and we say, yes, these are the guiding values and standards of our profession. It also has to do with accountability. It has to do with legal protection and things like that, risk management. And it also is intended to support us, right, in our practice. So like I said, it first is established in 1960. You can see here I have a link to the original document. You're going to see this is a whopper. It's a whole 1 page long. Look at that. It's changed quite a bit if you've read the new one. A lot longer, a lot more standards, right? You can see here it's much more broad and kind of really focused on just the idea that, we're kind of are articulating some sense that we're professionals as social workers, that there's some sort of standards. You see here privacy, responsibility for service, but it's in general pretty vague. So what happens after that? After the 60s, in 1967, they had some language around non-discrimination being really critical. In 79, it gets revised pretty substantially. So they go into 6 sections of standards, 82 principles, and a preamble. So it addresses this idea in that version of the fact that we have an ethical responsibility to clients, to colleagues, to our employers and the organizations we work for, to the social work profession, and to society as a whole. And that kind of framework continues on after that. And it also starts being used to enforce ethical practices at that time. In 93, there's some revisions to address dual relationships, to also address the potential impairment of social workers. What do we do if that happens? 96 were the most major recent revisions. So again, it kind of gets overhauled using somewhat of the same format in 79, but more or less rewritten in 96. And what we see today is fairly similar to the 96 version. There's a few changes that came later in the 90s about when folks should disclose things without client consent. And then in 2017, the most recent revisions had to do with technology, because obviously, electronic records, social media, all kinds of new questions have come up. So there's standards relating to that now. Okay. So what is in it and how is it organized? When you look at it, and we'll kind of go through it together here, you see these different sections. So the preamble is what we talked about when we were talking about kind of the purpose of the profession, right? And the preamble identifies our core values right here. The purpose, which I shared with you recently, is also here. Then we get to the ethical principles section, which basically illuminates our values. And so it takes this value, for example, service, and says, what does that mean, right? What does that mean for social workers? So it describes it, and then it kind of really fleshes it out. So there's where we kind of, again, are kind of this unifying body. This is who we are. This is what we believe. And then the standards are kind of how we enact those things, right? And also just things that we need to do in order to kind of be held to account as professionals. And so again, we talk about our ethical responsibility to clients, our ethical responsibilities to colleagues, our responsibilities in practice settings, so kind of to our organization, things like that. What do we do in different practice settings? What do we have to do? Our ethical responsibilities just as professionals, and then our responsibilities to the profession and to the broader society. So that's how it's broken down, okay? So you obviously, I'm hoping, have read this at this point. If you haven't, go through and read it. Okay, and this is the bulk of the document. As you can see, much longer than that 1 page document I showed you. Some very specific standards, right? So when we look up here at things like informed consent, we have some really clear descriptions of what it means to have informed consent. What do we do when a client may not have the capacity to provide informed consent themselves? Things like that are very well outlined in the Code of Ethics. But then if you look, you'll also find some things that feel a little bit more general or a little bit more kind of like a statement of values or kind of an ideal, right? As opposed to a this is what you must do. Let me find a good example. Those tend to be more towards the end. Um, so public participation, for example, social workers should facilitate informed participation by the public in shaping policies and institutions, all right? So again, it feels a little different. That's not so much of a rule as more of a guide, right? So there's these kind of broad things. One are, sets of things that are concrete things that you must do or must not do. But it also, again, like we said, it incorporates our ethical responsibilities to broader society. And so you do see some things that are a bit broader, okay? So that's the code. Like I said, if you haven't read it, make sure that you go back and read it very closely, because as we've talked about, you're held in our program not just to our standards, at the university, but also to the standards within the Code of Ethics. Okay? I just wanted to highlight really quickly some frequently used standards are ones that I think, are just really essential that we know. They're kind of concrete in some way. And they often are the ones that come up in ethical dilemmas. So again, just ones to really go back and review, make sure, again, read the whole thing, but these stand out. Not that they're more important, but they are absolutely things that you must know kind of the day you set foot in the field, right? Commitment to clients, this idea that clients supersede, their interests supersede other interests. So if there's a conflict between the interests of your client and the interests of your agency or your organization, clients come first. Right. Self-determination, right? The fact that it's really critical that's part of our code of ethics. It's not just a nice to-do thing, right? We highly value client self-determination, and we must do everything that we can to ensure that that's happening in whatever process we're going through with clients. Informed consent, I showed you that one before. So again, do people know what they're consenting to? Are you actively gaining consent? Are people fully aware of that? What are the boundaries of that consent? All of that. Conflicts of interest, so kind of understanding when we have a conflict, and that might deal with dual relationships, that might deal with other types of things, but what do we do when we have a conflict of interest, and in what situations would a conflict of interest prevent us from working with a client or a client group? Privacy and confidentiality, so that has to do with obviously keeping client information confidential, and under what situations would you need to break that confidentiality? Really important to know. Sexual relationships, so the idea that we don't have sexual relationships with clients or colleagues, that one's very straightforward. So if there's one that's just kind of black and white, I feel like that one is it. Not a lot of gray area on that one. Physical contact is interesting though, because there's a standard around just what do we do? How are we being really cautious and thoughtful about the way we use physical contact, so as not to ever, create discomfort in clients and things like that. 2.8 to 2.10 deal with what do we do when we have a colleague who might be impaired, who is incompetent, who isn't, who's practicing outside of the scope of what their training is, or when they're doing something unethical. And we do have obligations to actually, deal with our colleagues and report our colleagues at different times. 3.04 has to do with keeping client records, our obligation to, keep a record of services that are provided. Obviously, we do that in ways that are confidential, but, it's important that we keep records. And then 4.01 has to deal with competence, which is this notion that, again, we shouldn't practice outside our scope of training. And so if we don't have the skills, if we're not competent in a particular area, we should not be practicing in that area. All right, so we're going to do a little search when we get all together, but that's kind of the core. I want to leave you all, you're going to also, there's a whole nother video that you can watch on ethical decision making and kind of going through the ethical principles screen, the Dolgoff model, but I just want to leave you with some final thoughts and kind of, again, recircling back to that big idea I shared at the beginning. There's a supplemental video that I've shared in Module 3 as well. If you have time, you can watch it. It's long, but he's an excellent speaker on ethics. I've seen him before, and he kind of gets at this idea where, there's some standards where it's clear there's a standard of care, right? Like I said, sexual relationships, we don't have sexual relationships with our clients, right? That's kind of black and white. But there's so many situations in which reasonable people might come to different conclusions. right, about what is the ethical course of action. And so what's really critical is that we develop a set of kind of skills for decision making and that we can articulate our decision making, because that's really the standard of care. It's not always that we're going to come to X decision, but that we engage in thoughtful, critical reflectivity as we get into these situations, and that we can articulate those thoughts and our process. So I'll leave you with that. Looking forward to seeing you all again this week. Take care.